When I asked Antrese Wood what she dreamed of when she was a child, looking up at the vast sky with her daydreams of what she'd be when she grew up, she told me she was going to be a surgeon. That was her focus. She was going to go into medicine, she was going to be a surgeon, and one thing led to another, and she is today an artist, painting glaciers and creating the Savvy Painter podcast, which a lot of us are very familiar with. An interesting artist, a world traveler, and someone who has found a way to use new technology to not only advance her own business as an artist, but to help other artists advance theirs, to explore these new technologies, to understand how they help our revenue streams, how they help us promote our brands. So, and in talking to her for just the few minutes I was able to talk to her this morning, besides discovering we're fellow Californians, I just got this vibe and this energy that I can't wait for the rest of you to share. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Antrese Wood.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? First of all, I want to thank Kathy and Robin and AWA and everybody for putting this together. Can we get a round of applause for them? This is an amazing event. Okay. Thank you so much for having us. So, I recently started doing yoga again, and I have not been doing this for quite a while. So I find myself going into the studio trying to do all these crazy little poses and constantly afraid that I'm just going to fall back flat on my butt. And that's kind of the thing about trying something new. We get into this sort of like awkward teenager phase where you're just like in this really gangly position. And every time I do it, I'm always thinking, why would I ever go through this awkward teenager phase again? I did it once. It wasn't fun then. It's not exactly fun again. But I think that's kind of what we as artists do, is we put ourselves in these uncomfortable positions. We embrace the discomfort. And when we're in our studios, we are constantly in that position where we are pouring our hearts out onto a canvas and hoping that somebody is going to like this, and maybe they'll like it enough to trade us money for it so that we can keep painting. And honestly, sometimes I just wish that the art fairy would come in and sprinkle pixie dust all over my canvas in perfect complementary colors, and we would just be able to have that inspiration that just flies in through the window and just appears. And I think that's what a lot of people think being an artist is about. But when we create art, we make ourselves a little bit vulnerable, and we expose ourselves to criticism when we show our art. And that can be really, really scary. And so is speaking in person, by the way. I'm really used to hiding behind the microphone with my little headphones on, and it's more of a one-on-one thing. So standing in front of people is another thing that makes me pretty nervous, as I'm showing now. Thank you. But when we dare to show up, we give others permission to do the same. We inspire people, and we give other people permission to do the exact same thing. I'm going to show you a few images from another time when I took a big chance, and I met this amazing person who ended up being my husband, and he's here, as always, to support me. When I worked for Disney, and I quit my job there to pursue my own painting. And at the time that I did it, I really thought that I was going to take over the art world. I was going to quit my job, and everything was going to be amazing. And that was 2008. It was great timing. So, so I quit my job and I started showing my work, and I was selling a lot, and then the stock market crashed and the economy just kind of went to hell. But at the same time, I met my husband, and not long after I moved to Argentina, and I kind of had to start all over again and reinvent myself, because I was in this place where I didn't really speak the language. I thought I did, but I didn't. And so I created this project called A Portrait of Argentina. And what I did was I did a Kickstarter to fund it. And I ended up raising, it's like about $25,000 to do this project. And we spent the next 2 years driving around Argentina while I painted and got to know the country that I was now living in. The funny thing about this project was I kind of this was my first foray into, I would say, the social media. This was probably about 2012, I think it was. And I wasn't really connected to anybody. I think I had 100 followers anywhere. It was really, and I thought that was a lot. I thought 100 was a lot. But I started this project, and what I learned pretty quickly was that community is super important. I had so many people who just immediately jumped on board with this project and ended up getting it funded. So we spent 2 years basically driving from the jungles to the glacier and everywhere in between in Argentina. And that's what kind of got me started on full-blown on this obsession with glaciers. I'd also lived in Alaska for a short time and got to see some amazing glaciers there. And this started the obsession. So here's a few pieces of my work. We are now in Mammoth, California. So these are the Sierras in Mammoth, California. And when I finished A Portrait of Argentina, I really needed something else to do. I like big projects. And so I started the Savvy Painter podcast. And that was, that was about 3 years ago. And since then, I've interviewed almost 200 artists every single week. I talk to artists about what they're doing in their studios, how they create their work, what their process is, how they keep going as an artist, and what they've been successful at or not successful at. So since then, I've noticed a few patterns. First of all, artists are really, really stubborn. We have an unrelenting passion to create. We're a little bit bullheaded. We're extraordinarily focused, or if we want to be truthful about it, we're just completely obsessed with what we do. And there's no talking us out of it. So who else willingly goes into this business? As Kathy said, when I was a girl, I wanted to be a surgeon, and I was convinced that that's what I was going to do with my life. And as I was preparing myself to take that route and go to med school, not one person ever suggested I have a backup plan. Nobody ever thought, like, oh, you should get a teaching job as well, or maybe you shouldn't quit your waitressing job. They were pretty much, yeah, sounds good, go for it. And then I switched plans to become an artist. And there's a different mindset that comes with being an artist. I think you have to understand both the myths that we've been fed. We have this, we're constantly told, have a backup plan, you need to diversify, you should be, like all these other things that you can be doing. And as we saw with the last speaker, there's lots of ways that you can diversify within being an artist. But I want to talk first a little bit about the mindset of an artist, because how you're thinking and what you're doing while you're in front of the canvas really impacts the rest of your like how you decide to sell your art, how you decide to position yourself, and how you decide to present yourself as an artist. So hopefully what we're going to talk about here is we're going to give a few examples of how you can use your stubbornness and your bullheadedness to your advantage. So the first thing I want to talk about is choosing excellence. Kind of curious, how many people in here would kind of classify themselves a little bit as a perfectionist, maybe? Just a little bit? Quite a few people there. I definitely would say that I'm a perfectionist, and I struggled with that a long time because I felt like I knew it was hurting me, but at the same time, giving it up just felt like that meant that I would be doing things kind of half-assed, for lack of a better way to put it. And that really, that was one reason why I just never wanted to give that up. And I realized that, one interesting thing about perfectionism really is the fear of what other people think. When you're a perfectionist, you are worried about what will the gallery think? Will anybody on Facebook like this? You're worried about things like that. So perfectionist is kind of what will other people think. It's an external factor. Excellence, on the other hand, is more about what you think. With excellence, you're thinking about what can I do with what I have? And the question isn't about other people, it's an internal factor. So that takes a lot of pressure off when you're in front of the camera. When you're in front of your canvas, you can think more about what it is that you want to do and what your own standards are. Ann Gale is an artist out of Seattle, and I interviewed her for the podcast. Is anybody familiar with Ann Gale's work at all in here? A couple of people? I have an enormous amount of respect for this woman. She's one of my heroes, and I was very fortunate to be able to interview her for the podcast. And she tells this great story in this interview about this idea that when you take big risks, the art gods will come down and reward you. And she told me this story that I think really exemplifies this idea of choosing excellence and understanding what your own vision as an artist is. So she was working on this painting. She's a figurative artist. This is a self-portrait. She also does a lot of, this one is pretty small. I'd say it's like 15 by 18, somewhere in that range. And she was doing this huge figurative piece. And her pieces take about a year to complete. And so she started working on this, and she realized that during the time that she was painting on this, she kept looking at it and thinking, there's something wrong. There's something not right with this painting that I'm working with. And she has this really great habit of when she comes into the studio, every time she walks in, she sits down, and she will just stare at the painting for a half an hour without making a single move on it. So she just looks. And she gives herself that time to just absorb what's happening on the canvas and to think about why she started this painting in the first place. So she goes into her studio, and she's looking at the painting, and she's got the model set up, and she's looking at the painting, and she's looking at the model, and she's not really happy with where it is, and she can't figure it out. And all of a sudden she realizes that it's been about a year since she started this painting. And it was November, cold, cloudy day in Seattle, and all of a sudden she's like, I have been painting this with a completely different light. I started this in November. The thing that inspired me to start this painting was this cold November light. And I did a lot of the color work in the spring and the summer. And she uses natural light for her models. And she realized right then, and what she did was she completely redid the entire painting, just like she'd been working on it for a year, and she knew that it wasn't up to her standards, and so she changed the entire color scheme. And those are the big risks that we have to sometimes take when we're painting and understanding what our own vision is. Other people can look at that painting and go, wow, Anne, it's really beautiful. I don't know what you're talking about. Stay with it. It's fine the way it is. She looked at it and said, no, this isn't what I started out to paint, and I'm going to use my own internal compass to decide what I'm going to do. So the internal versus external compass is a really good signifier when we're in our studios and we're painting, being brutally honest with ourselves and say, where is this instinct coming from? Is it coming from myself, or is it coming from an outside source, an outside fear? Because usually those things, we have no idea what anyone else is thinking in the first place. So all these things that are running around in our head are kind of fiction anyways. So that brings me to my next point, which is the talent myth. Michelangelo said, if people knew how hard I work to achieve my mastery, it wouldn't seem so wonderful at all. And as you all know, there is no fairy that comes in and helps you out with your painting. It comes from you, and you all, I don't think there's a single person in here who is an artist who doesn't know how hard you have to work to get that. But this talent myth, there's a researcher by the name of Carol Dweck, and she spent decades researching how people think, how people learn, and how they respond to stimuli when things don't quite go as they wish they would. And so with that talent myth, she discovered that there's a fixed mindset and there's a growth mindset, and these are pretty common in most people. And the fixed mindset says, you know, you're born with it. You either have it or you don't. And that's kind of the problem with talent. So some people may say, like, I'm not really good at sports, or I've heard this a million times, I can't draw a stick figure, I could never do that. This mindset says that you are born with this, and it was given to you, and you have no control over it. And the problem with that is what it teaches people is that these naturals, or these talented people, or people who believe that there is this fixed talent that you have, they consider effort to be a contradiction of their talent. So what the implication is that if I have to work really hard for this, then I must not be that talented at all. And that mindset is, I think, where a lot of this imposter syndrome comes from. Has anybody else experienced that, where you do something really amazing and you're afraid people are going to find out it wasn't actually that amazing after all, or that somehow you're a fraud, you're faking it, that you don't really deserve to be here, you don't really deserve to be on the walls of that museum? A fixed mindset has a lot to do with that, because we think that in some ways people get, this is going to sound awful, but you kind of get like the superiority complex, where you think I'm talented, this is the way it is, and you don't realize how hard, you dismiss how hard you have to work for it. And so failure and rejection hits this type of mindset really hard, because again, it's that sort of contradiction of, if I were really that talented, it wouldn't be this hard. I wouldn't have to work so hard. So there must be something wrong. The growth mindset, on the other hand, has this belief that I can always improve. I can systematically look at what is not going right, and I can work to improve it. So with that fixed mindset says, to be good at art, you need to be naturally gifted, where in contrast, people with the growth mindset, the way that they think is how good you are at painting will always improve if you work harder at it. So with talent, you're always trying to prove yourself, and with growth, you're always trying to improve. And that's a really critical way to look at things when you're in your studio, is you have nothing to prove except to yourself. And so I think possibly a lot of people can relate with that, with those two mindsets, or those two things that happen to you when you're in your studio. And this idea that when you hear other people say, I could never do that, I could never draw a stick figure, all these things that we hear when people look at our art, which is really beautiful and flattering. But think about that when it comes to what you say to yourself in terms of, I could never start my own business, I'm not really good with business, so I don't really know, like, I'm just gonna hide in my studio and paint. All of these are skills that we can learn. So this idea of the fixed mindset and the growth mindset also applies to your painting skills, your business skills, your organizational skills, how you contact galleries. A lot of people say artists typically are very, very introverted. I would absolutely describe myself that way. The fact that I run a podcast I don't think anyone was more surprised by that than me. But all of these things you can learn, and you can use them to grow. So you've heard that advice, I think, that to become a great painter, you have to go through miles and miles of canvas. To do a good painting, you have to do 1,000 bad paintings. It's the same with all these other skills. It's the same with approaching galleries. It's the same with networking, that horrible word that artists really hate, that when you walk into a room and you think, oh my gosh, I'm so shy, I don't really want to talk to all these people. You go to your opening and you're standing there in front of these paintings just kind of like a deer in the headlight going, here's my work, everybody look over there. With practice, these are things that you can learn and you can improve on. Jill Carver is an artist that is anybody here familiar with Jill Carver? She's in Colorado, great. Actually, she splits her time. I'm so jealous of her. She's in, I think, Austin. She's in Texas. Yeah, she's in Austin, and then half the time in this beautiful, tiny little town in Colorado. Jill's a great example of this because this idea of growth, she was looking at her paintings and realizing that she really needed to work on her compositional skills and on her value study. So she got these books. She basically realized, this is a problem with my work. This is a weakness that I need to work on. And she spent 6 months just doing no-tans. Those are those little black and white studies where you figure out you make decisions about what's in the light and what's in the dark. And she spent 6 months just doing that, and her work she said that was a very pivotal moment for her, that after that her work just got improved amazingly. And it's not about the no-tans as much as it's about her seeing something that she needed to improve on and making it her mission for the next 6 months to do that. Cami. Cami is here today. Cami is another artist that I interviewed for the Savvy Painter podcast. And in our talk, I was really, she's another very good example of this idea. Cami, I'll tell your story. She's looking at me like, why are you talking about me? Cami went to Mary Pettis. She went to Mary Pettis and wanted some help with her paintings. And I thought it was really funny, her story, but Mary told her, I think she said, I don't know if I want to mentor you right now, but go paint 100 trees, and when you've done that, come back to me. So Cami was looking for help on how she painted trees. And here's where I was just blown away. She did it. She went and painted 100 trees, and then she came back to Mary and said, what do you think? That is a beautiful example.
It was in a beer box. My 100 paintings were in a beer box. Like they hold them in the house. And I was like, okay, here.
Yeah, can you imagine when she walks up?
So here, I still have one question. She went, okay, come in.
You can't, what are you going to say to that? It's such a beautiful example of that whole mindset thing. Take off your tutus. How many people in here studied ballet as a child or took ballet or any ballet? Anybody dance? Any dancers at all? Ballet and dance? How many of you looked at this and thought, she spelled it wrong? So take off your tutus. What I mean by this is these are all the things that we tell ourselves. I'm too old to start. I'm too young to start. I'm too shy. I'm too introverted. I'm not too good at business. I'm too unfocused. These are all things that just completely destroy our ability as artists to grow and move ourselves forward. So I want to ask everybody, please take off your tutus. Because really, beating yourself up over your artwork or whatever it is that you think you're not doing, it never works, ever. If it did, we'd all be millionaires. We would all have six-packs. I don't. Jane Carney is, I'm sorry, I always say Jane, it's Jan. Jan Carney is an artist from Australia, another person that I interviewed for the podcast, just beautiful story. She had, she didn't start painting until she was 40 years old. She had this very terrifying health scare that sort of put things into perspective for her. And going through that health scare made her realize life is short. You never know what's going to happen. I'm wasting my time doing things that I don't want to do, and what I want to do is paint. So she picked up a paintbrush and started painting. She's now, she's gotten portraits into the National Portrait Gallery. She's just doing fantastic, but she just decided this is it, and I will make no excuses, and I'm going to do everything that I can to grow as an artist and to make this work. So I asked Jan if she had any advice for other artists, and this is what she said. She said, be kind to yourself, respect yourself and your art for where it is. Don't wait for validation. Don't be silly like that. Just be convinced that what you are doing is the right thing and keep doing it. These are dominoes. So I'm sure you guys are all familiar with the domino effect. You take one domino and you knock it down and it knocks another one. We've all played with them. I find it interesting that usually when people talk about the domino effect, when they're not actually talking about knocking dominoes over, that it's usually a bad thing, you know? It's like one little thing and then it's the domino effect and my life is just ruined right now. But I like to look at it in the opposite way, that one small achievement, one small move to better yourself in your art or to get yourself out there knocks the next one over. It's about consistency. Consistency builds on top of itself, and so that's how we can use this idea of the domino effect to inspire us to continue to push ourselves and to do the things that are uncomfortable. One small bit of effort knocks down the next piece, and so on. This is something, I'm a little bit of a geek. Actually, I'm kind of like a really giant nerd. I love science. I love all this stuff. This is something called force amplification. See if I can use. So this where is it? This right here is a tiny little domino that's about 1 millimeter high. Each domino after that is 1.5 times larger and heavier than the last one. And when you knock that series of dominoes down in 13 steps, the last one is 1 meter high and 100 pounds. In 29 steps, it could knock down the Empire State Building. That's what force amplification is. So I'd love for you guys to take my nerdy little habits and think about what that means for you in your studio and in your art business. What are the things that you're avoiding? What are the look at how little it is. It's so tiny. What is the tiniest little step that you can take to start that domino effect for you? So this consistent practice over time has the same effect on your painting skills. It has the same effect on your business skills. It has the same effect on getting up here and standing in front of a bunch of people and talking. When your practice is consistent and focused, you make huge, huge leaps over time. This is why economists are so in love with the idea of compounding interest. When you make these tiny little investments made early, it creates amazing wealth over time. I mean, how many people wish that you just put 20 bucks a week in the bank since you were like 12? Just imagine that. That would be pretty awesome. So these small investments made over time will make great impact on your art. It builds on top of yourself. This compounding interest can be used to increase your focus. I get a lot of emails from artists as I'm doing this podcast. It's so wonderful, the response that I get, and it's just, I don't know, it's kind of overwhelming. It's really, really sweet. I get these people pour their heart out to me, and they tell me what it is that they're struggling with in their studio and with their artwork. More and often, I'm hearing this, that as artists, or I think as human beings, we're all having a problem with focus. There's way too many things that are fighting for our attention. Focus is another thing that you can slowly, over time, build your resistance to it. I think with the internet, with Facebook, with our iPhones that we're constantly looking at, we've built the habit of not being focused. You can build it back up. That's not permanent. Insights. With this idea of consistency and the consistent practice, it doesn't matter if it's 15 minutes a day, it doesn't matter if you have a full-time job. When you are consistently practicing your artwork, you're more likely to get these insights over time. It's kind of like going to the gym, I think. Like, if you think about it, if you didn't eat right, and then once a year you went into the gym and you worked out really hard, it wouldn't really have that much of an effect. But when you're consistently working in your studio, you are more prone to having these amazing insights because you're in there all the time. You're ready for it. You're seeing it more often. You can have these. You can be working on a painting and have just this small realization, and the next day you go back in and you start working on it, and it feeds off of the last one. Inspiration, also, I get a lot of emails about people not really sure. This is more with beginners. I don't think I would have that in this group, not knowing what to paint, not knowing what their next move is. When you're in your studio consistently, whether it's every day, every week, you have this locked time period, these insights and inspiration, they start coming. So with consistency, even if it's just 15 minutes, like with consistency and with this idea of growth, we're looking for small wins. We're not looking for major things. It's that domino. It's that 1.5%. It's that small, tiny little increment. If you're having problems getting into your studio because you're working full-time and you have an incredibly full life, 15 minutes will start you in the right direction. Kathleen Dunphy was one of the, I think she was like number 3 in all the artists that I interviewed. And she talks about how her difficulties in getting in the studio and difficulties with people not respecting her studio time. When you become a full-time artist, I don't know if this happened to you, it definitely happens to me, that people go, oh, she's home. I'm going to stop by and have a coffee, or oh, well, like she can, Antrese, you can just paint whenever you want. We're going to come by and, like, don't you have time to go to lunch? Kathleen also had that problem, and I loved what she said, which was basically you would never expect to drop it. if you were a banker, you would never expect them to just suddenly drop everything because you happened by. So when you are as strong with yourself as, I'm looking for the right word, you have to be really there's no excuses with any of this, that when people come by your studio, you are working, end of story. I work from 9 to 5, those are my hours. Love to see you after 5, but this is my time. This is, I think, really hard for artists because we want to be flexible, and maybe sometimes that's how we procrastinate a little bit, you know? But when we treat our business hours, our studio time, I know business is a dirty word in the arts, as a business and are that strict with it, people will respect it. People know. You have to set your own boundaries. So that this idea of consistency and growth applies to the professionalism as well. That idea of being really, really honest with yourself about what's going on, when you're making excuses, when you're not, we have to make that a habit as well. It's really easy to just say, oh, this one time it doesn't matter. It also, facing rejection and being a good boss to yourself or other ways that building up these skills over time, the consistency of that is super helpful. And life is always happening. So when I talk about, you know, facing rejection and being a good boss, I'm talking about being a good boss to yourself. Be brutally honest with yourself when you're making excuses, but at the same time, show yourself some grace. Cameron Schmitz, she is on the East Coast. When I interviewed her, we talked a lot about how she managed running a studio and a gallery with her 3-year-old daughter and how she incorporated that into her studio practice. Right after I interviewed her, she found out she was pregnant with these 2 beautiful little boys. She has twins. So Cameron, at this point now, has a 5-year-old and these 2 little boys. They're amazing, but that's what I mean by life is always happening. Nothing is predictable, and so we have to learn how to incorporate all of these things into our studio time. There's like I look at it as kind of like there's this accordion of expansion and contraction with how we run our businesses. So there will be times when you need to, if you have an exhibition, for example, then your studio time is taking up all the accordion. Your studio time is expanding. And that means that your business, like your housekeeping part is contracting, or how you spend your time is contracting. And understanding that that happens, I think, takes a lot of pressure off of the artists. So that when you have to spend more time with your family, you're not feeling guilty because you know you've already put that time into your studio and vice versa. I want to talk a little bit about the systems that we can use in our studio and in our lives. And this is, I think business can be a dirty word for artists. Structure, whew, we do not like structure. But structure means, I think structure equals freedom. It's really, really simple, but it's not easy. Camille Prejwatic is, she's an AWA member as well. I saw one of her paintings in the exhibition. She is an artist that I see as being extraordinarily structured. She has she runs her studio out of Northern California, and we talked a lot about her advertising structure and how she looks at the business and the advertising point. Doesn't matter what's going on in the economy, she is always keeping that going. That's always a part of her structure. And that's how she's able to spend so much time in her studio and in her painting, is that this is a part of her everyday life, that she just gets a little bit done every day, so it never turns into this big giant thing that takes over her time. So when I say make it non-negotiable, it's your studio time, it's how you run your business, it's all the things that we need to do to keep our art together. Your stubbornness is an asset. Use it. that unrelenting obsessiveness that we have, that unrelenting obsessiveness can be used for, look at that, use that to focus on the long game. This is not a sprint. This is decades and decades of work. And it helps immensely. I've seen so many people that I've interviewed talk about this, getting clear on what you want and what is important to you. We want everything all the time, I think. There's so many different ways that we can approach our art, and there's so many different things that we can do. There's so many different ways that you can, just think about everything that you've heard today from other people have talked, all the different ways that you can promote yourself, all the different ways that you can show your work. When you get crystal clear on what you want and what is important, what that does for you is it allows you to say no to the things that don't matter. So if you, for example, know for a fact that, let's just say Facebook isn't your thing. I know that's shocking in this day and like today, if Facebook isn't your thing, but if you know Facebook isn't your thing, cross it off your list, stop worrying about it, and keep doing the things that are working for you. So maybe you don't like Facebook, maybe you like Instagram better, maybe you don't even like social media at all, but you're doing a lot of other things that are working for you, keep doing that. There's no reason to do, like when you know exactly what's working and what's not and what matters to you, then again, saying no, that's a very important word, not just for 2-year-olds. And that gets me to having a plan and reviewing it regularly. So this is another habit that is, I think, super, super important, super impactful. And a lot of artists that I've talked to talk about the fact that, plans don't really work for me. I made a plan and then it didn't work, so I'm just kind of winging it. The review part of that is how you get around that. So if you make a plan and you're going to do something, let's say you have a plan, you want to get into a particular gallery, or you want to get into a museum, or you want to do X number of paintings in the next year. At 3 months, review it. Be brutally honest. Where are you? What happened? Where did you fall off the horse? What caused that? Then you can adjust your plan and make it more realistic for who you are, how you work, and what's actually going on in your life. Because again, life is always happening. Something is going to trip you up. Count on it and plan for it. It doesn't have to be a surprise. When you're making a plan and something, when something gets in your way, oftentimes it's either poor planning, which is normal. That happens to everybody. So if you didn't plan right, really dissect it and what didn't you plan right. If something got in your way, like for Cameron, it was a beautiful thing, but she wasn't really expecting twin boys at that time, you adjust. And that's part of life. It doesn't mean that you can't plan. It just means that you're alive and that life is happening. So before I wrap this up, I would love to take any questions. I know I blew through a lot of stuff really quickly. Yes.
I don't do social media yet, but can I look at your podcast on the internet?
Yes, you can.
Okay.
It's at savvypainter.com.
Well, what exactly is Savvy Painter Podcast? Is it a service you offer? What is it?
Savvy Painter Podcast is a podcast is sort of like a radio show on demand. And you can go onto my website and listen to it, or if you use any Apple products, they have a podcast player, and you can find it that way. So what it is every single week I do interviews with artists, and we talk about their work, we talk about their studio practice, we talk about their struggles, we talk about everything. Like there's almost no questions barred. I dig in and ask them a lot of questions. And yeah, let's see, there's about 170-ish interviews that I've done. It's been downloaded 1.3 million times, which is, I really actually didn't know there were that many painters out there. It's pretty amazing. So yeah, so that's what it is.
But did they pay you to do that?
No, this was my own little idea. When I was in Argentina, I realized that I had lived in Los Angeles. I went to an art school in Los Angeles, and I worked for Disney. So in that whole area, I was always surrounded by other creatives. I moved to a really small town in Argentina and realized, like, wow, I had a lot of support that I didn't even realize, and I kind of took for granted. So I wanted to keep a community of artists, and that's why I started it.
So my question is, and you probably sense a little bit of a generational thing here, but the whole podcast thing then becomes a revenue stream in your art business. Yes, is that how that works? And how does that work? And how does one start a podcast?
Ooh,
Briefly.
boy. Briefly, okay. Well, technology being what it is today, it's pretty amazing. What you need is a laptop, which you probably could just do it with a laptop. To be honest, I started with a laptop and the little white earbuds. That's the only technology that I had when I started. And so I basically contact artists, call them up, would you like to speak? Would you like to share your story? And some say yes, some say no. And then you get a hosting service, and you register with iTunes, and then iTunes will, just kind of throws it out into their world. And in my case with Savvy Painter, what happened was the first couple episodes, I think like 10 people listened to it, probably 5 of them were me and my mom, me checking like, is it working, and my mom saying like, wow, look at what my daughter's doing, this is amazing. And so, yeah, that's what the technology that you need to start it, almost nothing. And then in terms of the revenue streams from that, so it took me a long time to figure that out because honestly, when I started it, I just wanted to do it. I didn't really have a plan for it as a business. I just wanted to create this community of artists, and I just kind of started that way and figured like, okay, I'll figure this out as I go along. So the revenue streams come in through, now I have sponsors and donations from people who listen to the podcast. And I also do a lot of online classes. So people listen to the podcast, they contact me, they want to study with me, and I do that online.
So for a podcast, could somebody advertise, like let's say a paint company?
Yes. Yeah. So with podcasting, I think what's really interesting in terms of advertising and revenue, it's different than traditional advertising revenues because effectively I have an audience who is listening to me every single week. And I become kind of a part of their lives. They listen to me when they're in their studios, they listen to me when they're exercising or wherever. And so they feel like they know me, so I'm really, really careful with who I choose to sponsor because I feel like I feel a very personal responsibility. And then what happens is I'll work together with a sponsor and we'll create sort of like a script that I feel comfortable talking about, and then I incorporate that into the podcast itself. So if you've listened to the podcast, you probably know that I've had the two main sponsors have been Turkel paintbrushes, or Turkel art supplies, and Gamblin paints. And what I'm exploring right now is I used to do the sort of traditional, you have like 15 seconds or 20 seconds up front where I talk a little bit about them, and then in the middle of the podcast I break it like a commercial break. and then we go on from there. And with Gamblin, what we did was we did a Q&A with Gamblin. So I invited people who listen to the podcast to submit their questions for the podcast. And then Gamblin came on and answered them all. So that was an hour-long sponsored podcast that was just incredibly helpful to the artists.
That was one of my favorites.
It was the interesting thing was that was by far the most popular podcast. Ann Gale, who I showed you, she held the top spot for like a year and a half. Like no one was close to Ann Gale. She was the most popular episode. I did Gamblin, and like within a week they passed her, and I was just like, whoa, I did not expect that.
And I don't know if you all know, but podcast is an app on your phone or your iPad, so you can actually record it and listen while you're driving at another time or whatever. So
Yeah, it's
or flying. Or
yeah, it's like a little.
So you just listen, it's not visual.
Yes.
It's like a radio.
Yes, it's like it's a radio show on demand is probably the easiest way to think about it, that you can decide when and where you listen to a particular radio show as opposed to waiting until 3 o'clock on Fridays, as an example, whenever it comes out. So I can see
One is, what's your process of preparation for the podcast? So you feel as if you can steer it in certain ways to keep a level of interest. And also, how has it helped you to receive the information that you get from everybody that you interview?
Okay, so the first question was how do I prepare and how do I steer the conversation? Most artists are, so I Google a lot, and I look for, the first obvious place I go to is their own website, and I look at that, and then if there's any press that they've had, I read through all of that. And I have I have a list of questions, a series of questions that I give to the artist and say, this is kind of the flow, this is what I might ask you, but I ask a lot of follow-up questions. I think it probably helps that I'm an artist and I'm a total nerd, like I said, and so I will just, like I'll hear something and say, ooh, I want to hear more about that. And that part of the conversation ends up being a little bit more interesting, I think, than any canned questions that I might have. I think that's probably the strength of my podcast, is that I've sort of naturally avoided the canned questions. If you listen to the podcast, probably the first X number of episodes when I was learning how to do it and getting more comfortable with it, I probably stuck almost exactly with those questions. So the first, let's say 20, 30, I don't know how long it took, you'll probably hear the same questions over and over again, and then you'll see that I just naturally started getting more curious, and I almost rarely stick to those questions anymore. So I'm blanking. What was the second question? Darn it. You had a second question.
How has it actually?
Oh, how has it helped me personally?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, that's huge. Okay, so how it's, Ann Gale actually gave me a really hard time about it, because I started, when I was talking to her, I was just like really digging in, and I also know her. I had the amazing opportunity to study with her for a while. And she's like, you're just I see what you're doing. This isn't really about providing help to all these other artists. You're getting your own little MFA right here. I kind of am. So I've taken, how it's helped me personally is I've taken pieces from almost every single episode and go, I'm gonna try that. There was an artist that I interviewed by the name of Chris Gallego, and if you ever listen to that episode, you'll hear me like absolutely shocked when I finally figure out that he does everything with a palette knife. And I know, Carol, you're also a palette knife painter. I couldn't see it in his work. It was really amazing. And so after talking to Carol and Chris, I started using the palette knife as a tool in my work, and I would do like entire, just playing with it. And so there's like little pieces from every single person that I'm like, ooh, I want to try that.
Does it pull you off? And do you ever feel that it actually
So the question is, do I feel like all that information pulls me out of my own center? No, I don't. Because I think that I've sort of developed, a strong enough vision for my own work that I can kind of pull it in, play with it, keep what works, and trash what, with all due respect, and go, it's great that works for you, but it's not working for me. To me, it's kind of like if you are trying on an outfit, you're trying on a new style, and you're like, oh, that's really not my thing. I'm not gonna wear that. It's kind of like that, or you're like, oh, I like this accessory. It's kind of cute. I'm gonna keep that. So I kind of do that with all the episodes. Yes.
Antrese,
Yes.
You were just talking about vision. What is your vision?
For my
art, for the future, and where you're going?
Ooh, big question. I like it. Okay, my own vision for my art. Like I said, I am really obsessed right now with glaciers. I'm absolutely in love with them. And for my own art, so Kathy mentioned that I had always wanted to be a surgeon, and then I suddenly switched to art. And a large part of that was because short story, I was at a school, I didn't like it. I had to stay, or I would lose all of my scholarships. So I'm kind of a little snarky sometimes, and so I'm like, fine, be that way. I'm just going to take all art classes if you're going to make me stay. And so I did, and it changed everything for me. The class that made me absolutely fall in love and realize that I will spend the rest of my life on this was a color class. I love color. It's so much fun to play with. It's like, you all know, like when you mix something and you think it's going to react a certain way and you put it down and it does something totally different. So exciting for me. And so with the glaciers, that fascination, that obsession with color and light, I think for me, glaciers, as a painter, that's the thing for me with the glaciers. That, I can make this thing I can paint almost this entire thing without using any blue, and then just knock something in and the whole thing changes. That's, mind-blowing. And then as glaciers in and of themselves, they're being destroyed, they're falling apart. I've seen, I lived in Alaska for a while, and there was a glacier that I could actually ride my bike to, and I think if I were there, I would have to ride another 10 or 15 miles to get to it. So that definitely inspires me to paint them. And did I answer your question? For the podcast, I could talk more.
Antrese,
Yes.
you're the one in the show, the glacier in the show? Is that
Yes.
okay? Oh, it's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions for Antrese? I know what we do have, which is a big round of applause.